this weekend, Paul?
I went to the No King's Day March in central Manhattan and hung out with a bunch of people with many quite creative signs. So one of them says, "No kings, yes queens," which is a very New York thing.
Yes.
Except it turns out Manhattan is officially Kings County. So
Was that right?
yeah,
Isn't Queens where Trump came from?
yes, it is. It's
Oh, wow. Well, I can see there's a double entendre there.
yep.
Okay. So this is the third in our series, the Wolf-Krugman Exchange. I'm Martin Wolf, Chief Economics Commentator at the Financial Times.
And I'm Paul Krugman, a professor at the City University of New York and author of an independent Substack newsletter.
Today, we're going to talk about the world economy at a period of great uncertainty. So, since we last sat down to speak, there's been a devastating plane crash in India. President Trump took the extraordinary step of putting the National Guard and, even more strikingly, the Marines onto the street of one of the greatest of American cities, Los Angeles. Look, Washington was the site of the country's first military parade in decades, apparently to celebrate Donald Trump's birthday. At the same time, millions of people took to the streets to protest the assaults on democracy being carried out by Trump and his administration. And a Democratic lawmaker was assassinated.
So, timestamp is especially relevant today because we're having this conversation as the leaders of the G7 countries are meeting for the second of their 3-day annual meeting in Alberta, Canada. So, for the record, it's 2 p.m. in London and 9 in the morning in New York on Monday, the 16th of June.
So I think we're going to focus today on our discussion on what's going on globally, and particularly what this G7 meeting is about, and why it might matter, and how it should or does fit into the general discussion of the global environment. But before that, I'd like just to very briefly, Paul, to get your sense of these rather remarkable political developments in America. What happened in LA, these protests, what do they leave you feeling about your own country?
Well, we are in a very strange, if I might say, very un-American state of affairs, where an attempted crackdown on people who might or might not be immigrants, are immigrants but might or might not be legal, being basically rounded up in parking lots in Los Angeles, and then the president attempting to militarize the response, which is of dubious legality. I guess we'll get that sorted out. And it's a very strange thing. It looks much worse on TV than it is in reality. The fact of the matter is that there are 13 million people in greater Los Angeles, and the vast bulk of them are not experiencing anything as a consequence. But that's pretty amazing. And then this was the weekend. Trump held a military parade, allegedly for the Army's anniversary, but in fact on his birthday. So a real sort of Red Square type military parade in Washington, which was supposed to glorify him. And at the same time, there were protests around the country, the No King's Day protests. Um, the results were, let's say, not what Trump would have wanted. Hardly anybody seems to have showed up for his parade. Even the VIP stands were mostly empty, and it looked kind of pathetic. And we don't have a hard count, but it looks like probably 5 million or more people protested across America. So, if we were another country, you might say this looks like the beginnings of a color revolution, right? It was a really massive outpouring, and how this affects the political situation going forward, nobody knows.
One thing that I noticed was a comment from his education secretary. Or a bit puzzled by that because I thought the Department of Education had been abolished. But anyway, she said that, apropos Harvard and the administration, that it was the duty of the university to align its teaching and its objectives with the policies of the administration. This is about as clearly fascist a point of view as I've ever read. And there doesn't seem to be quite as much excitement about this remark as I would have guessed, but I suppose by now everybody's used to this quite extraordinary set of ideas.
Yeah, we're pretty kind of accustomed now to the idea that um, whatever Trump believes in, certainly it doesn't believe in what we've considered to be traditional American or traditional democratic values. He views it l'état c'est moi. I mean, it's pardon my horrible accent, but it's all supposed to be on his behalf. And I guess we are kind of desensitized to it because it is absolutely routine in the United States right now.
I'm still I'm abroad, and of course I still have expectations and views about what the US stands for. And of course I have a personal family background in Germany and Austria during the 30s, as some people know, and I find it pretty amazing and pretty horrifying that Americans can get desensitized to such quite extraordinary views.
Yes, although you do want to bear in mind that we just had truly massive demonstrations, possibly the biggest mass demonstrations in American history.
Well, that's encouraging.
Yeah, it does say that America is not yet lost, is the way I would put it.
Well, let's turn our perspective on something which is more within our professional areas of competence. The G7 is meeting in Canada, and the G7 is the meeting of the major industrial countries, so the US, Canada, um, uh, Japan, and the larger European states, UK, Germany, Italy, France. And they've sort of thought of themselves as collectively guiding the world economy, even after the group of 20, a much bigger group, was created after the global financial crisis. And so here they are meeting in Canada, and you've got Trump on one side, engaged in a trade war with all the others. And so, what on earth is this for?
Well, I mean, the question all along really has been, what is the G7 for? I mean, the G7 grows out of the G5, which was created during the Plaza Accord in 1985, when everybody sort of agreed that the U.S. dollar had gotten too strong, and we needed a coordinated policy to correct that imbalance. And the dollar did come down, though to this day, nobody is sure whether the G5 had anything to do with it. And then they added a couple of countries. Um, and what exactly do they do has always been a real question. I mean, we know what the purpose of the World Trade Organization is. We do definitely do need, or did need, when we're breaking it up, but coordination on international trade policies, coordination on international macroeconomic policies. Uh, Hundreds and hundreds of papers have been written by my colleagues in academia, including myself, desperately trying to find good reasons why we must coordinate macroeconomic policies. And it's not an easy case to make. And the G7 has kind of inserted itself into a bunch of other issues, but it's an ill defined purpose. It's maybe a chance for world leaders, and in this case, the leaders of democratic countries, to get to meet each other, to build some level of personal trust, less about actual policies. And of course, at this point, I don't think there's a whole lot of personal trust going to be coming out of this meeting.
By the way, this could well be wrong because not as young as it was, but I think the initial G5 was started in the mid 70s during the oil shock.
It could be, but we think of this as mostly coming out of 1985 and the Plaza Accord on the dollar, and that's when this notion of regular consultation came on. And then there was a whole period. I was, very much young academic on the make, and everybody wanted to be the one who wrote the definitive paper explaining what the purpose of these groupings was, and we never did actually come up with a good answer.
So, one obvious problem with this meeting, lots of important countries aren't there. In this case, I think the Mexicans are coming. I was told the Brazilians, South Africans, but the Chinese aren't there, for example. So, if you are going to have a sort of committee to run the world right now, at least the world economy, pretty obviously would need these people there, wouldn't you?
Yeah, in fact, even the way you put it, it's the industrial countries, but these days, China is the workshop of the world. I mean, China, I don't know the numbers, but I wouldn't be surprised if Chinese manufacturing production is pretty much comparable to the entire G7. So, depending on how you measure it, the world's biggest or second biggest economy is not at the table. And um, Very hard to imagine any kind of global economic strategy emerging if the most important players are not there. So I actually have no idea what they're going to be talking about.
Well, that's a very good question. I understand, I've been told that they're not going to bother to produce a communique, probably because it would only register their profound disagreements and the fact that they are actually in the middle of a trade war. I think Zelensky is going to be there, so that's presumably going to be about another argument about what on earth Trump's trying to do about Ukraine. I wouldn't even begin to try and work out or discuss that because to me it's completely impossible to comprehend.
Can I break in with what maybe a slightly funny story? I mean, there are multiple groupings of countries that gather together and produce communiques. And many, many, many years ago, I spent a year in the U.S. government. And I would go to meetings at the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Basically, all the world's rich countries and a few ringers are members. It has no line responsibilities, no power really, except that it does a lot of data collection and reports, and sometimes is quite influential. And I would, as the staffer, senior staffer accompanying my principal, and the United States being still top dog, I would actually write the minutes, not the communique exactly, but the minutes of the meeting. Um, the thing was that the minutes of the meeting had to be written on the last evening of the conference, which meant that there was a whole day of talks still ahead. And I would have to write the minutes based upon a forecast of what would be said the next day. And then there would be a sub meeting, which at that point was just the US, Germany, and France, where they would negotiate the minutes line by line to eliminate phrases that one country or another found objectionable. And, it really was kind of a silly exercise. It was, and by the way, it wasn't at all hard to predict what would be said the next day, which in a way, again, tells you what it's like. So I have a pretty cynical view of what all of these meetings are about.
I tend to the view that, as Winston Churchill once said, George Shaw is better than war. People should at least meet, have some idea of what other people are interested in, what their bottom lines are, and it's better than having complete ignorance of one another. And if it's just achieves that, it's better than nothing.
Exactly what this meeting, well, I guess better to have them meet than to have complete silence, but wow.
Let's talk about some of the real economic agenda at the moment, and in a longer term. Um, I mean, one of the pretty obvious issues is that the 90-day quote unquote suspension of the Liberation Day tariffs of April the 2nd is due to expire fairly soon, not much more than a couple of weeks. Um, so what's going to happen then, and what might it mean? Any sense of this? My colleague Robert Armstrong has coined this wonderful acronym TACO. Trump always chickens out, and it's gone viral, as I can see.
Yeah.
And of course, the implication is that uh, July the 2nd or whatever it will be will just pass and nobody will notice. But is it possible, really possible, that we'll suddenly see all those horrifying tariffs imposed by the US in 2 weeks, starting trade war two?
Well, it's very important to understand that the trade war never went away. That Trump modified those April 2nd tariffs on April 9th, and then modified the tariff on China after that. But there, by no means have we gone back to anything resembling the tariff levels that prevailed before, depending on which estimate you use. But the average US tariff rate is now on the order of, let's say, 17%, up from less than 3% before Trump began his stuff. It is so we've gone from having the highest tariff levels in 100 years to having the highest tariff levels in 90 years. That's where we are now. So if this is chickening out, boy, it's still we're still in an extremely protectionist regime. And all that we're really talking about is whether sort of the little bits of it that got chipped away will come back, or whether there'll be some reorientation. I guess for some countries, it'll make a big difference. If you're Bangladesh, you're currently facing 10%, which on the original tariffs will go back up to 34%. But if you're China, or even the EU, I mean, it's currently 10. It was 20 under the original plan. These are still very, very high tariff rates. So I don't know, the idea that, I mean, it's conceivable that Trump will say, "Okay, we got what we wanted," and back to the trade regime as of April 1st. Um, that seems extremely unlikely.
I think that's a very, very important point. The obviously the trade regime of the world has been changed quite profoundly under almost any plausible assumptions, and of course, this sword of Damocles is unquestionably still hanging over the world because Trump has made it very, very clear he's not bound by anything. All the international agreements that the United States has reached over many, many decades with bound tariffs and all the rest of it, which I think we discussed in our first episode, have gone. And so we are in trade policy anarchy.
Yeah, and it is probably worth pointing out. Look, the core, the whole international trading system that existed until a few months ago was built on the idea of non-discrimination. That the same on any given good, the same tariff applies to everybody, and the United States has completely ripped that up. So the Trump administration has violated all of our existing trade agreements with what it's done. So why think that whatever uh, handshake deal, whatever takes place in Alberta, is going to matter?
Now, that raises quite an important question, which I addressed last week in my own column on the world economy, which is what should the rest of the world be doing about this situation in trade policy, not just vis a vis America, but vis a vis one another? Should they say, okay, we are going to stick to the agreements we have reached? We are going to stick with non discrimination. So, except where there are very clear exceptions for free trade agreements or customs unions. We will follow the rules of the GATT WTO, and we will continue to abide by the rulings, arbitration process within it. And indeed, we might go beyond that and try to reach serious agreements in other areas that really matter to us. After all, they are still the bulk of the world economy, the bulk of world trade, certainly the bulk of global carbon emissions, all the other collective action problems that we clearly understand, and say, okay, if the US is going to do this, well, that's your problem. I won't get into whether they should retaliate, though I think that's also important. Um, what would you advise them? And then if you go there, and this is what I think the rest of the G7 should be thinking about, they should say, okay, we're going to put most of our effort into other groupings with countries that look more cooperative. And in economics, for sure, well, maybe China looks not so bad now.
Yeah, I mean, it takes some work, I have to say, for a U.S. administration to make the Chinese look like reliable, trusted partners. But compared with recent U.S. behavior, they are. China does a lot of stuff that you can complain about, and it's an old line that in China a contract is a suggestion. But the Chinese have been a lot better at adhering to agreements in the last few months than the United States has. Um, there really is no good case for the rest of the world to emulate the United States. The fact that the United States is imposing all of these, Liberation Day tariffs, is no reason for Britain or the EU to do the same thing. We're already seeing some rapprochement between the UK and the EU. Canada has this unfortunate. See, it's the Mexican line, but it applies to Canada too. So far from God, so close to the United States. China, there are long-standing issues there, but those issues don't have to become worse just because the United States is behaving erratically. Um, Retaliation against the U.S., that's an interesting question.
That is the question. What do you think?
Well, I think so. The Chinese are doing it. I mean, the Chinese are actually playing significant hardball, and they're doing it in an intelligent way. The Chinese seem to understand, which I don't think the U.S. administration does, that ultimately trade is not about exports; it's about imports. It's about what you can get, and the Chinese have been limiting exports of um, rare earths, specialized batteries, things that the the United States does not have the industrial base to produce at this point. Give us time, but right now we don't. So the Chinese are in a position to actually inflict significant damage in a trade war. They also take it because America is an important market for them. Uh, but the Chinese seem to be actually engaged in an active strategy of calibrated retaliation. The EU has not, and I don't think it's going to. I mean, there's a case for doing it, but I don't think they're going to. But as for the rest, yeah, the possibility the World Trade System goes on as before, but without the United States, is certainly technically possible. In fact, simply honoring existing trade agreements would cause that to happen. What we don't really know is the political economy. We've always relied upon the United States as providing, to use the international relations jargon, hegemonic stability. The U.S. is the big player, and it's the United States' commitment to the rules that helps keep everybody else obeying the rules. Can the EU is a pretty big player too, and if the Chinese want to be good guys on this, they can be, but this is going to be tricky, and one of the big questions out there.
I think the really big question is indeed, well, a big question in the trading scene is whether the fragmentation that is now come from the US will be, as it were, replicated
Yeah.
on an ever finer scale in the world, in which case the costs are going to increase, and for some countries, smaller countries, likely to be really high. Or will other major powers, and we've discussed some of them, um, actually say, well, it's not really in our interest to do this.
Yeah.
Yes, we have some bilateral problems, the EU does with China, no doubt, but blowing up the entire edifice is not in our interest. I think that's what the EU thinks. I think it's what China thinks, though China's relationship with these rules, as you rightly said, is a sort of a bit open to interpretation. And if the US wants to go away, let it do so. I am inclined to think that, really, for demonstration effects, the larger powers in Europe and China in particular should be retaliating. And I also agree with you that the Chinese are doing it very sensibly, very intelligently. It seems as though they've been planning for this. Surprise, surprise. After all, they did have a trade war with Donald Trump not so long ago, and I suspect they have been thinking about it, quite apart from they want to reduce their strategic vulnerability in crucial sectors. But I made the point in a column I wrote, well, a month or two ago, on who would win the trade war, and said that uh, China looks to be pretty well positioned. For the United States, a trade war against China, which they backed down from to a significant extent, was a supply shock. And this is a perfect example of what the supply shock could mean. For China, it's basically a demand shock. And well, China has the means. I've been arguing this for many, 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 many years, to increase demand if they want to. The constraints are just their unwillingness to use fiscal and monetary policy in standard ways. They have a huge external surplus. They're a net creditor of the world. Nothing constrains them from getting round this problem if they want to. So I think one of the things that interests me is, why has the US been so overconfident about its hand in this trade war they've started?
Well, yeah, and I don't know if you said it or somebody said it, but the on U.S. China, it's a lot easier to pursue Keynesian policies to offset some job losses than it is to stand up an industrial base that you don't have, and
Exactly. It's a
that's
beautiful way of
basically.
putting it. No, that wasn't me, but it's the same point, essentially.
Yeah. Um, and if you ask about U.S. overconfidence, well, this is a general American problem that we tend not to really believe that the rest of the world exists. And to the extent we do, we tend to think that we have much more power over it. And this is not unique to Trump, though this may be an especially ill-informed group of people we're talking about now. But the idea that the United States could shape the world in its interests was very prevalent at the time that we invaded Iraq, and it was crazy. even then. Just obvious if you looked at the, not remotely did we have that kind of sway in the world, and even less so now. But if we have a president of the United States who believes that um, every time that some country runs a trade surplus with the United States, that means that we are subsidizing them, uh, then he's going to have a view of the world that does not correspond very much to actual economic realities. And uh, pro- probably a rude awakening coming quite soon.
I would like just to briefly move to another vulnerability before I go back to a bigger macroeconomic issue, which is connected to what's going on in the Middle East right now. Um, when the October the 7th massacre occurred, I wrote one column, the only column I've written on this, about what it might mean for the wider world economy. I have personal interests here, but I didn't think they were suitable for columns. But if it ended, and I argued this now quite a long time ago, in a war between Israel and Iran felt cornered, there had to be a danger that Iran would act uh, essentially to close the Straits of Hormuz and close the Gulf. And since it's right there and has lots and lots of missiles
Yeah.
and tankers are very, very vulnerable, that could happen. Um, and I've been very surprised by how confident people seem to be, though the oil price, of course, is rising, that that won't happen. Now, of course, we're not as vulnerable to oil as we were in the 70s, but an awful lot of the oil production of the world and does go through the Gulf still. It's still the largest reserves in the world. So this seems to me potentially it could happen that this will be another big shock in a whole series of big shocks.
Yeah, and it is worth pointing out the technology of war has changed in ways that often seem to give smaller powers more ability to inflict harm than in the past. The United States basically fought a war with the Houthis in Yemen, and basically we lost. It wasn't dramatic, but the attempt to suppress their ability to fire missiles at passing ships, we didn't manage to do it, and we lost quite a lot of hardware in the process. And Iran is immensely bigger than that. And so the idea that this could cause major disruption, and yeah, the world's a lot less oil dependent than it was in 1979 when the Iranian Revolution uh, precipitated a global economic crisis. But still, the ability of Iran to disrupt flow of oil from other places, not just themselves, is much bigger than it was then. So yeah, this is a among the big um, sort of tail risks out there, maybe not that far in the tail.
That's very much what I think, and that's why it's very dangerous. Though I sort of understand some of the logic, but to corner this regime and tell them that actually what we're after is your destruction. If you corner somebody who's right there and has lots of drones and missiles, with all the Gulf oil fields within range and the Gulf itself, seems to be pretty dangerous.
Yeah, and you do kind of wonder who's thinking this through. To get too American, but if you start to ask what's been happening to the U.S. intelligence community in the last few months, think about what's been happening to the U.S. Pentagon and State Department during the last 2 months. Are there any adults left in the room?
Well, I remember one adult who I was very much impressed by at the time, Colin Powell, in Gulf War One, and he used to say, I think he said it several times, you should never start a war if you're not absolutely clear how it's going to end. And that
Yeah,
seems to me, given history, including the last 60 or 70 years of American history, that's pretty good advice.
yeah,
So let's move back. We've discussed this oil risk, which is obvious and it remains there. Um, I want to discuss something rather different, which I've been thinking about for quite a long time. Um, that we agree, obviously, that the trade war, as prosecuted, is impossible to justify, and particularly noticeably true for this concern about the Americans have had now for a long time about imbalances, structural current account deficits and all the rest of it. Now, on that point, I don't know whether we disagree or not, but I just want to say it does seem to me there has been an issue about the role of the US, as it were, in balancing the world economy's demand and supply by being, in some sense, the demander of last resort. I mean, savings and investment have to balance across the world. Basic Keynesian economics, the world economy is a system. Lots of countries, very important countries, have set up their policy regimes pretty obviously to create very large current account surpluses, trade and current account surpluses, which are structural. They're investing for that. Their financial systems are designed to produce that. And if you're going to have balance at something notionally like global full employment, high activity, then somebody else has to run the counterpart deficits. And clearly, the US is far and away the best suited country. And of course, if the US is going to play that role, by definition, some institutions in America are going to run deficits, very large deficits. And since the financial crisis, that's basically been the government. Now, I think having the government, US government, run deficits in this situation is better than alternative, but it's not ideal. So the US demand that savings and investment balances should be changed and current account surpluses should be changed in countries like Germany and China above all has always seemed to me perfectly reasonable. And the question is how we have the discussion and what we should do about it. What is your view on this, on both the importance of the issue and what, if anything, can be done about it?
Well, there's an interesting question here, which is whether the U.S. runs a trade deficit, which is the necessary counterpart of the surpluses being run abroad. Um, it's not at all clear that that per se is really a problem. We have a somewhat smaller manufacturing sector than we otherwise would, but not as big a deal as many people think, and not as an especially big deal for things like the overall level of wages. But the political economy is bad. It certainly feeds into protectionist sentiment in the United States. We have a large budget deficit, which I don't think is actually being forced upon us. I think the reason that we run a large budget deficit is it's a kind of a political impasse in which everybody wants somebody else to make sacrifices. And that is starting to reach the point. I've long been a very much a deficit dove. Don't get too worried about it. But at this point, the deficits are getting extreme enough, and the U.S., all our ability to ride with these deficits runs ultimately on the belief of the world that, well, look, this is America. It's rich, it's stable, it can get its act together when it becomes necessary. And do we still believe, at least in the stability part for America? So I think that's a real problem. Now, I don't think you can blame the Chinese for our budget deficits, but the Chinese trade surplus is disruptive. You can argue that the rest of the world should just be happy to accept cheap money from China. Why not? Except that that's not how it works. It is, in fact, a source of major political tension. And one of the negative miracles of world policy has been the apparent inability of China to decide that, okay, we can't continue to invest 40 to 50% of GDP each year, which means we have to have more consumption, and instead trying to export their problem through trade surpluses. And that is, if it wasn't for Donald Trump and all of that, that China's continuing refusal to really address its structural trade surplus would be the biggest source of conflict in the world economy today.
I agree very much with most of that, and I'll add one point, and then I'll make an argument against you, if I may. I'd add the point that, in my view, it's very much in a book I wrote on the crisis, that Germany's very similar structure, though operates in a different way, was a root cause of the Eurozone financial
Yeah.
crisis. And that links with the way in which I disagree with you, but I must put this in a very clear and nuanced way because it's important to get my perspective right. I agree with you completely. The fact that the Chinese run a huge current account surplus with the US bilaterally and a huge global one doesn't necessitate a huge fiscal deficit. There were many other possible outcomes. But if you think, given that China is so big, it has to be a credit-worthy global borrower that is the counterpart. It sort of has to be the US, at least in significant part. There isn't any other set of countries that could run counterparts to Chinese surpluses. And then if you look at the history of the domestic counterparts to those external deficits, by definition, if the US runs huge current account deficits, then in its government sector, its private corporate sector, and its household sector, someone has to be running large counterpart deficits. But if you go back to the early 2000s, and I remember writing a lot about it then, that stage, the huge counterpart deficits were being run in the private sector, particularly the household sector. And that, of course, as you knew very well and you wrote about, was the counterpart of this huge housing boom and this huge credit boom, which blew up pretty spectacularly. So I do think that the Chinese policy did diminish US options in a certain respect. Either you run large fiscal deficits and or you run large private sector deficits. And if the corporate sector actually is getting enough funding from its point of view, so it's roughly in balance, which it is now in terms of savings and investment, that ends up with the household sector. And when the household sector goes on a huge borrowing boom, as we saw in the US, UK, Spain before the crisis, it ends up horribly. So one way or another, it does leave the net borrowers in the system in some trouble.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the causal links for the United States are pretty unclear, but uh, but the principles, right? And yeah, and look, the world's two largest economies have different are seem to be unable to have coherent macroeconomic policies in different directions. The United States uh, is unable, apparently, to basically raise taxes. Fundamentally, the solution to the U.S. problem, we're a low tax country and we need more revenue, but we can't seem to do it politically. And the Chinese, even more weirdly, it should be fun to spend money and boost consumers, but they have weird political constraints. I mean, listening to Premier Xi talk about uh, uh, aiding Chinese households, increasing consumption, and he actually sounds like a right-wing Republican, worrying about encouraging a culture of dependency and so on. So the have got their hang-ups. The United States has got a political deadlock. Not a good thing. I mean, so many things going wrong in the world, but this is an enduring problem that is not going to end well.
Yes, I think it's a background irritant. And if the Chinese didn't feel this was the way of solving their domestic problems, which I agree with you are completely incomprehensible, I've been writing about this for a quarter of a century, and it seems to me very puzzling that a still relatively poor country can't get its consumption share of GDP, public and private, above 60%. It's pretty weird. Uh, uh, the but they don't seem to be able to do so, and the US ends up as the counterpart. But if I look at global economic problems in the macro trade field, this is the one that they ought to have been able to work out a path to fixing in the last 20 years. And it's absurd, it seems to me, and it's so much linked with this irritation in America that we haven't been able to fix this because it's not that difficult.
And by the way, this is the kind of thing, to circle back a little bit. Um, this is the kind of thing where a grouping like the G7 could be helpful, not in the sense of actually dictating policies to China. Nobody can do that. But in the sense of possibly offering China's own leadership a little bit of cover to do things that one hopes they understand they should be doing. I mean, way back, we both have been around this for a long time, but the Japanese used to have this phrase, I think, gaiatsu, which was about essentially exploiting U.S. pressure to do things that their leadership, in fact, wanted to do and knew they needed to do, but it was helpful domestically to be able to say, well, we have to do this because of the Americans. And in some ways, China could be doing the right thing, saying, well, we have to do this because of the other members of the G7 say we need to act. And so this could be a minor positive if we had a different set of, well, at least one person of the G7 was different from who he's actually going to be. Um, by the way, the other thing to backtrack there is when we talk about the possibility of kind of a sustained global economic system, trading system without the United States, one of the big obstacles to that is the fact that China is running these disruptive trade surpluses, and we're not going to be able to really um, construct a World Trade Organization minus U.S. System if China doesn't resolve this enduring imbalance.
I have to say that one tiny bit of optimism I have is that a couple of months ago I was in China for a week, and I was talking to a number of officials, and the sort of and I made some arguments on these lines in columns too, which is, well, the US has really become very unfriendly to your surpluses, and you must have worked out by now that the claims you're accumulating on the US in the process, in various ways, are not quite as sound and solid as you would like them to be. So, in this situation, surely you will really want to get rid of these surpluses, or at least only invest them in really safe countries. It's not quite clear who those are now. And many of the Chinese policymakers I met among economists are pretty clear that's right. I mean, I've never met so many people who really want to get consumption going. Um, and I think when the Chinese really decide to do things, they do them. So I'm a little more optimistic at the moment about this because they look at the world, they can work out what's going on. They're not completely crazy. You might see more change at the moment than we have been expecting.
It's certainly possible. I mean, it's one of those things, that the world's two greatest economies are both gerontocracies run by old men whose views of how the world works are decades out of date. And it may be that waiting just behind them are people who are willing to think differently. So, yeah, I have some hopes. It's just hopes. I know nothing.
So we should move to our cultural coda. And I've done something perhaps mainly influenced by what's been going on in the last week in Los Angeles and sort of frightening realities of America, which matter so much to us all. So I've gone what in some sense, which is but what is both one of the most magnificent poems I know and a bit of a cliche, but I think the cliche is so right that I'm proud to do it. So it's William Butler Yeats' Second Coming, which there will be a YouTube link, and it's a magnificent poem. It was written in 1919. He was Irish. It was the time of the fight for Irish independence, and it was, in some sense, looking towards the catastrophes of the following 2 decades. And I'll just quote a few lines from the poem because they are the core of what he said, and I think it's just frighteningly truthful today. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood dim tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity.
Well, um, in a way, not that different. I actually found myself going to an old Peter Gabriel song, Games Without Frontiers. And the verse is, if looks could kill, they probably will. In games without frontiers, war without tears. If looks could kill, they probably will. In games without frontiers, war without tears. Um, there's again, this kind of uh, mindless nationalism to the extent it's a song and songs shouldn't actually be too literally interpreted, but it really felt kind of appropriate listening to it now. It's uh, things haven't changed much except that we used to have a relatively benevolent um, hegemon over here on my side of the Atlantic, and With the hegemon abdicating, I'm not sure what happens.
And of course, the relevance to that, though this is not, I think, quite what Yeats was writing about, was just after America's entry into the world in the last couple of years of World War One, with some pretty controversial effects in the Versailles Treaty. The United States then withdrew completely for more than 2 decades, and pretty terrible things happened, of course. And America got dragged back in 1941, and that's the beginning of the hegemonic period. So it does seem sort of relevant to where we are now, because in a way that's where Yeats was, though it's a wider issue back then.
Yeah, I suspect that Yeats had no idea just how prophetic his poem would be.
Yes, but the I've often thought that the very greatest poets seem intuitively, he was a very great poet, to understand reality in a way that a conscious mind was not aware of, and that's one of the great values of these sorts of creative people.
Well, maybe the creative people will save us.
I hope so. Somebody has to. It's lovely to talk again, and till the next time. On that note, thank you very much for joining us for part 3 of the Wolf-Krugman Exchange. We'll be back with you again next week when we'll be discussing artificial intelligence and impact it's having and likely to have on the world in which we live.